Writing at the turn of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, as well as playing a major role in it, influenced by the likes of natural philosophers, or as we know them today, scientists like Galileo and Copernicus, as well as attempting to shake off the influence of past intellectual movements such as scholasticism and Aristotelian thought, René Descartes, a Frenchman, scientist, and brilliant mathematician, set into motion modern philosophy as we know it today. Descartes' approach to philosophy, while still under the spell of the past, was almost entirely novel and represents a turn in the way in which philosophy was done. To fully understand Descartes, it's important to appreciate the context in which he found himself, and so we shall take a quick detour into the events that led up to Descartes' revolutionary attitude towards philosophy. In his famous work, The Discourse on Method, Descartes makes it clear that he is dissatisfied with his education and the intellectual climate of the 17th century. He believes that his education, while useful, has actually instilled in him far more doubt than certainty. This is no surprise, as the threat of skepticism was always lurking around each corner. But as soon as I had concluded the course of studies, at the end of which I was usually admitted to the ranks of the learned, I changed my mind completely. For I found myself so overcome by so many doubts and errors that I seemed to have gained nothing from studying, apart from becoming more conscious of my ignorance. Discourse on Method, Book 1, page 7. The threat of skepticism was so prominent that many religious authorities, theologians, philosophers, and scientists found themselves amongst a sea of doubt, with certainty and truth a faraway mirage. The only escape from skepticism was in Scripture. Faith in God was the last refuge for many 17th century intellectuals. Besides the Bible alone, however, two philosophical movements held a great deal of authority during the time of Descartes. These were the previously mentioned scholasticism and Aristotelianism, and they go hand in hand. Scholasticism was a theological and philosophical method adopted by many academics and universities during the 1600s as a way of harmonizing Christian theology with the likes of Aristotle and Platonic philosophy. In this way, scholasticism attempted to incorporate past philosophy and use it to justify Christian theology, whereas previous thinkers rejected such approaches as heresy. Famous scholastic philosophers include St. Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham. The Aristotelian tradition, on the other hand, took its influence directly from its source, Aristotle himself, as well as the Neoplatonists. As such, Descartes tasked himself with revising philosophy and saving knowledge from the prevailing skepticism without appealing to Aristotelian or scholastic philosophy. He was to construct a wholly new philosophy, drastically different from his predecessors and his contemporaries, so much so that he's been dubbed the father of modern Western philosophy. Methodological doubt. In order to start anew, to free himself and subsequently all of philosophy from past dogmas, Descartes first creates a methodology aimed at ascertaining absolute certainty. He constructs this method by way of radical doubt, the greatest form of process elimination ever attempted by man. To call into question absolutely everything, and even if the mere possibility of error presented itself to him, he was to disregard it as certainly false. Through this method of radical skepticism, Descartes believes he can arrive at some foundational truth, basic knowledge, so basic that it cannot even be doubted. This search for the indubitable is so radical that Descartes warns the reader of its consequences, and suggests that such a task ought to only be attempted once in a lifetime. He also presents us with a set of rules that will safely guide us through such skepticism. The rules are as follows. Accept as true only what is indubitable. Divide every question into manageable parts. Begin with the simplest issues and ascend to the more complex. Review frequently enough to retain the whole argument at once. As well as these four rules, Descartes recommends that the reader, for the sake of their own well-being, construct a new, provisional morality that will occupy their minds before completely deconstructing everything. Now, before beginning to rebuild the house where one lives, it is not enough to knock it down, to provide building materials and architects, and to have the plans drawn carefully. It is also necessary to have provided oneself with another house in which to live comfortably while the rebuilding is taking place. Discourse on Method, Part 3, page 18. He also suggests a modest, conventional way of life, a life that doesn't disrupt the status quo, a life that respects the laws of the land. In short, changing oneself to the whims of the world is favorable for this contemplative effort, as opposed to trying to change the world. With this method in place, one can proceed in their radical skepticism. The Cogito. In an attempt to flee the cold, René Descartes shuts himself in a room with an oven where he had 3 dreams in which he credits the origin of his new method, and arguably the most well-known phrase in philosophy: I think, therefore I am. The famous Cogito. From this, Descartes takes a foundational approach to epistemology and begins his journey with this thought. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. How does Descartes arrive at this apparent axiom? He begins by employing skepticism. Yes, skepticism, that thing we mentioned earlier that Descartes sets himself up against. This is where many err, in thinking that Descartes himself was flirting with skepticism, even going as far as branding him a solipsist. This could not be further from the truth. René Descartes merely utilizes skepticism as a cognitive tool in order to guide readers into a correct foundation. Not that I thereby imitate the skeptics who doubt only for the sake of doubting and pretend to be permanently undecided. On the contrary, my whole plan was designed only to convince myself and reject the shifting ground and sand in order to find rock or clay. Discourse on Method, Part 3, page 22. Descartes uses skepticism to challenge empiricism, withdrawing the mind from the senses and instead turning inward to our innate ideas of the essences. Empiricism, he argues, is a result of childhood naivete carried into adulthood, a prejudice born out of sense perception, typically leading us to seek out benefits and avoid harms. While this may be pragmatic, he points out various instances in which our senses fail us, such as when we look up into the sky and see the moon. Despite how small it appears to us, we know that it is in fact much larger. Further, he argues that if our senses have failed us in the past, as with our perception of distant objects, they cannot be relied upon for absolute certainty. Furthermore, Descartes relies on the argument from dreams, that while one is dreaming, one is not typically aware of it. In fact, I ask you, the viewer, to try to ensure that you are in fact watching this video, and not in bed having a very lucid dream. Even further, to truly cement his doubt in the senses, Descartes devises a thought experiment in which an evil deceiver has complete control as to what you accept as true, capable of deceiving you of even the most obvious things such as mathematical truths and the existence of the physical world. Of course, we must admit that these scenarios are a tad silly, but nonetheless they represent, at the very least, that certainty may be much harder to grasp than previously thought. Again, however, many err in thinking that Descartes' attitude towards empiricism is of total disparagement. Much like the belief that Descartes was a solipsist, this is not true either. Descartes only denies the senses of the ability to know essential natures of things, while allowing for the simple natures of things to be grasped by the sense perception, which we will cover later. At this point, knowledge seems to be in a lot of trouble. But, says Descartes, there is at the very least one thing which we can be certain of: our own existence as a thinking thing. No sense perception required, even if we were dreaming, and even if there really were an evil deceiver forcing us into error and falsehood. One thing we can always be certain of is that we are thinking, because doubt itself is a form of thinking. Thus, I think, therefore I am. This is the indubitable foundation Descartes' method has discovered. The act of doubting, of thinking, ensures that we exist as a thinking thing. The cogito, as it has been called, is so clear and so distinct that he reckons clarity and distinctness to be the mark of truth. Descartes' epistemology, then, can be described as foundationalist, with the cogito as a basic belief. Justification in Cartesian epistemology is indubitability, the inability to doubt, which is the same thing as saying a belief is clear and distinct. If a thought is clear and distinct, it is indubitable, and therefore it is certain. But Descartes does not stop there. Basing his metaphysics upon his epistemic claim that clarity and distinctness are the mark of truth, he seeks to establish various results concerning the nature of reality, God, matter, and mind. Mind-body dualism. Continuing with only clear and distinct perceptions, Descartes' next clear and distinct perception is that he can doubt the existence of a material substance, including that of his body, but could not doubt his own existence as a thinking thing. Next, Descartes had a clear and distinct perception of mind as a non-extended, thinking substance, and a clear and distinct perception of matter as an extended, non-thinking substance. Finally, Descartes realizes that while his body can be divided, in fact he can even lose a limb, his mind cannot be divided. From this, he concludes that mind and matter are separate substances because, while his mind possesses the properties of indubitability, non-extension, thought, and indivisibility, matter does not. Matter possesses the opposite properties of dubitability, extension, inanimacy, and divisibility. Thus, since they do not share the same properties, they must be separate substances with unique properties. Here, Descartes is employing the identity of indiscernibles, a metaphysical principle stating that it is impossible for two or more distinct entities to share all the same properties, because if they did, it would merely be one entity. From this, Descartes begins to compose his very own philosophy of mind, wherein he attempts to describe the nature of the mind in contrast to that of the physical substances. So, mind is a thinking thing, and matter is an extended thing. But what other attributes do these substances have? Let us first analyze Descartes' conception of the mind. Mind, other than thought, has two chief faculties: the intellect, whose principal attributes or modes include pure intellect, sense perception, and imagination, and the will, whose principal attributes or modes include desire, acceptance, denial, aversion, and doubt. The intellect and the will work together. The function of the will is to affirm or deny propositions brought forth by the intellect, or vice versa. The intellect's function is to propose certain propositions to the will, which either affirms or denies them. Next, we shall analyze Descartes' conception of matter. Matter, other than extension, has the principal attributes or modes of size, shape, position, and motion. In summary, Descartes' conception of mind and matter is that they are two separate, distinct substances, both of which have different modes. Then, as I was examining what I was, I realized that I could pretend that I had no body, and there was no world or any place in which I was present, but I could not pretend in the same way that I did not exist. Discourse on Method, Part 4, page 25. God. With the Cogito standing as the building block for certainty, and indubitability, clear and distinct belief serving as the mark of what is true, Descartes then moves on to question of God's existence, and whether or not God is a deceiver. Descartes begins, of course, with his own existence as a thinking thing, and takes note of the fact that within him is the idea of an infinite being, but that he himself is not infinite. He finds this strange, and working under the assumption that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in the effect of that cause, and applying this principle not merely to the idea of God as a mental state, but to the content of that idea, God himself, Descartes reaches the conclusion that the idea we have of an infinite being is the effect of an actual infinite being, the efficient and total cause. In other words, he characterizes God as infinite, and argues that a content that represents infinity necessarily requires an infinite being as its cause. After all, we finite humans cannot possess the idea of an infinite being unless an infinite being exists who put it there, much like how hot water must have been heated by something which is itself hot. He then equates an infinite being with a perfect being, arguing that perfection is a property only of existent things, i.e., a perfect thing necessarily exists. Perfection implies existence, meaning that if infinity and perfection go hand in hand, a perfect being must exist, as existence is a prerequisite for perfection. Further, he concludes that a perfect being cannot be a deceiver, as deception and fraud depend on some defect, some imperfection. Thus, an infinite, perfect, non-deceptive God must exist. I understand clearly there is more reality in an infinite substance than in a finite substance, and therefore, the perception of the infinite occurs in me in some way prior to that of the finite. That is, the perception of God is prior to the conception of myself. Indeed, how would I understand that I doubt, that I desire, that is, that I lack something and am not completely perfect, if I had no idea of some more perfect being by comparison with which I could recognize my own deficiencies? All of these ideas are surely such that, the more carefully I examine them, the less likely it seems that they could have originated in me from myself alone. Therefore, one should draw the conclusion, from what has been said, that God necessarily exists. Why do humans err? If God is not a deceiver, why then do human beings consistently make mistakes regarding metaphysical truths and ethical decisions. If the intellect were created in God's image, why would a benevolent God allow us to err? Why would a benevolent God create us with faulty cognitive abilities and inaccurate sensory organs? Why, with a God-given will intrinsically aimed at virtue, do humans act in unvirtuous and even evil ways? Descartes has an answer, and it relies on his conception of the mind and its two chief faculties as mentioned before, the intellect and the will. He reconciles God's perfection with the human error by appealing to free will. For Descartes, both God's will and man's will are equal in power and capacity. They are equally free. However, humans have a finite intellect, while God has an infinite intellect. Thus, intellectual and moral failures result as an inequality between the finite intellect and the infinite will. That is to say, their inequality produces error. What this implies is that if the human intellect could judge all situations with a clear and distinct intellectual perception, or if man were to limit his actions to those of acts of will which are clear and distinct, all intellectual and moral failures would cease. As for sensory failures, God sets up the mind-body relation in such a way that our senses serve as a good guides for most circumstances. But since senses depend on sense organs, nerves, and media, and circumstances may be abnormal, nerves may be damaged, and media may be suboptimal, our senses are fallible. God was working with the finite human body and doing the best he could. Where do my errors originate then? They result from this alone. Since the will extends further than the understanding, I do not restrain it with the limits of the understanding, but apply it even to things I do not understand. Meditations on First Philosophy, Meditation 4, page 48. Descartes' Rationalism. Now that Descartes has established the Cogito and the existence of a benevolent God, he feels that he can now rebuild knowledge from the ground up, now with a much sturdier foundation. He's going to do all of this only using his mind, while, as mentioned previously, Descartes has a rather negative epistemic view towards empiricism, he does have a positive view towards rationalism. We will now take a look at why this is. Descartes starts by commenting on the properties that wax possesses, primarily its solidity and opaqueness, and then imagines if such wax were to be heated. The wax, of course, loses its former properties of solidity and opaqueness, begins to melt, taking on new properties, fluidity, transparency, etc. He gathers that it is not by sense perception, nor by imagination do we grasp the essence of the wax, but by pure intellect alone. He goes on to explain that the true essence of the wax, and matter in general, is not its modes, its shape, its color, its size, its motion, as these are merely modifications of its essential nature, its breadth, width, and height, extension. This is what was meant when I said, Again, however, many err in thinking that Descartes' attitude towards empiricism is of total disparagement. Much like the belief that Descartes was a solipsist, this is not true either. Descartes only denies the senses of the ability to know essential natures of things, while allowing for the simple natures of things to be grasped by the sense perception, which we will cover later. It's later now. When I said that Descartes denies the senses of the ability to know essential natures, what I meant was that he denies the senses of the ability to know things like extension, the actual essence of matter. He does, however, allow for the senses to gain knowledge of modes like shape, color, size, scent, etc., what are referred to as simple natures. Again, for the sake of clarity, the pure intellect, one of the three modes of the intellect, has the ability to know essential natures. Sense perception and imagination, the other two modes of the intellect, are relegated to knowledge only of the modes of corporeal things, not the essential nature of corporeal things. Finally, Descartes grounds the pure intellect in the mind alone, as it is the only mode of the mind which can exist independently of the body, while grounding the other modes of the mind in the body, as imagination and sense perception can both only exist as embodied properties. Cast in this light, we can set up Descartes' philosophy of mind as follows. Mind. The essence of mind is thought. A. Pure intellect, which is incorporeal and can know essential natures. B. Imagination, which is corporeal and can know modes or simple natures. And C. sense perception, which is also corporeal and can know modes or simple natures. Here, at last I have returned unaided to where I wish to be. I know now that even bodies are not perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagining, but are perceived only by the mind, and that they are not perceived by being touched or seen, but only by being understood, and therefore I know clearly there is nothing that can be perceived by me more easily or more clearly than my own mind. Meditations on First Philosophy, Meditation 2, page 30. Conclusion. Descartes' place in modern Western philosophy as the father is well deserved. His ideas lead us out of the era strangled by Aristotelianism and scholasticism and direct us towards the era of enlightenment in which science and philosophy thrived, so much so that the most of philosophy after his death, all the way up to Hegel, is written, in some sense or the other, as a response to Descartes. That is to say, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and Hegel all owe something to Descartes. Given this perspective, we can see why studying Descartes is so important, because his thought influenced some of the greatest minds the West has known, and if we're to understand any of them, be it Locke, or Hobbes, or Marx, or Nietzsche, it is perhaps paramount to first grasp Descartes. Finally, one thing we didn't get to touch on was that, if you paid close enough attention, you might have noticed that in many places we have not used the term truth, but rather certainty. This was by no means an accident. Descartes, from simply changing his language from truth, a concept that has some divine, objective baggage to the term, to certain, a term which is ultimately subjective and individualistic, unintentionally moved the focus of epistemology away from divine religious authority and placed it into the hands of the subject, the individual. And that about wraps it up, the whole of Cartesian philosophy condensed into one video.